Hello, everyone. Since today's guest comes from Mexico, I thought I would do a blooper from Mexico. And this is an example of exactly how English words can be misused, and therefore why you need a professional language agency to check everything before you use either an AI version or a version done by an amateur. And the was a sign in an Acapulco restaurant that said very simply in English, "The manager has personally passed all the water served here," which does not quite convey the same meaning as it should, because the word passed, of course, has multiple meanings in this case. So today's guest is Teo Husemann. Teo has been working with global organizations for more than 25 years. He has worked in many industries, ranging from entertainment and tech to telecom and sporting goods, and has held roles at local, regional, and global levels. Some of the brands he has worked with include Pepsi, Nokia, Addias, and ASICS, all based in Mexico. He currently heads the Reebok brand in Mexico and focuses on team development and strategic thinking. His past positions have also involved licensing and entertainment property management, point of sales development, and retail management. Welcome, Teo. Glad you're with us.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Okay. So before we begin, perhaps you could tell us a bit about your very interesting background and how you got involved in so many interesting companies.
Well, to tell you the truth, I come from, my parents were both in advertising. So I started being involved with brands at a very early age. So at the beginning, I really wanted to be a copywriter for advertising agencies. So even when I was in college, I started working for agencies like BVDO and Walter Thompson. So that's when I started with my love for brands and working with global brands. But just right after college, I started working in a very interesting industry that's basically entertainment licensing for consumer goods. I had a chance to work with very cool brands like Men in Black, Godzilla, Spider-Man at the very beginning. So and I worked there for a few years. And then I was fortunate enough to be recruited for Pepsi. They wanted to have somebody that used my expertise in managing licensing and entertainment properties for promotional activities. So I got recruited there, especially doing trade marketing and promotional activities for what was then called on-premise companies. So I started doing a lot of promotional activities for cinema chains, quick service restaurants, so on and so forth. And then I stayed there. I started working in brands, a lot of new initiatives. I did the first Red Bull competitor in Mexico for Pepsi, which was really interesting. And then after a few years, I moved to Nokia. They wanted somebody to manage their trade marketing department for Mexico and Central America. Then I held a global role with them, managing a global operator called American Mobile. Then I had the luck for 7 years to be at Addias, first managing sports style, then the whole brand. Then I jumped to ASICS and finally to Reebok, where I am right now.
Wow, that's quite a wonderful progression, quite a wonderful jump, as you say.
So yeah, I've been lucky enough to be involved with some of the great brands in the world.
Since you've mentioned Reebok, let's start there. How is the marketing of Reebok similar or different in Mexico than it is in the United States?
Well, some of the channels are similar. For example, department stores, sporting goods stores, some of the multi-brand stores have actually been in Mexico. The Athlete's Food was here at some point, but the problem with the U.S. versus Mexico is that U.S. is very diverse, right? You have many different regions with many different customers. Mexico, you can actually divide, let's say, into 3 different tiers: the 5 major cities, secondary cities, and then the rest. And in that sense, the major, let's say, retailers, department stores are on the bigger cities, and then the rest you can actually cater through secondary tier distributors. And the other thing that has changed a bit and might be a little closer to the US is, of course, e-commerce. Right now, we have a very strong e-commerce business, and you can get from there to all the rest of the country, not just to the major cities. So that's one of those things that is actually a bit different from the US. In the US, you have major cities everywhere. You have maybe 35, 40 major cities. In Mexico, just five. But otherwise than that, we have a close relationship to the US. A lot of the things that happen and the way that are marketed in the US impact Mexico. And that's one of the reasons why we have to be very aligned to marketing strategies, segmentation, and product distribution to the US.
Um, you're mentioning about I guess the diversification, certainly of the US market and the Mexican market and the different tiers. One of the principles of international business is that you adjust your product to your target country or your target culture. I presume that because you're dealing with international footwear, that the actual footwear itself is not going to change. But are there ways in which you've had to adjust the product to the local market?
Right. Well, the thing is that you basically use the global range and then you select what's adequate for your market. And that's one of the important things, that you have to have both knowledge of the global catalog and see what fits into Mexico. There's certain quirks. You don't change the product as much as you try to segment it correctly to each of the channels. That is one of the bigger challenges that you can have as a marketing a global range to Mexico. So basically what you do is you take the global catalog and you select which product goes into each channel, and then you try to find the right pricing strategy. But it's not as much. Sometimes when you're able, what you can actually do is find SMUs, so dedicated product to the country, maybe in pricing, maybe in styling. But those are the exceptions. 99% of the product will come from global range, and you'll try to use whatever is designed from the Reebok design group that is based in Boston. So, and then of course you can actually design additional products for Mexico, but you usually take the global strategy as a base for all that.
And you were talking about pricing. Does the pricing in Mexico differ because the standard of living is so different from the US?
Well, there's a few factors into it. The first one is that getting product into Mexico is more expensive than the US. So probably what happens is a lot of people think that sporting goods in Mexico are going to be cheaper. The reality is that the import duties are higher, so we might have a difference between $5 and $10, being the US cheaper. The other thing that actually impacts this a bit is exchange rate, of course. The market in China or the products in Asia are based in the US dollar, but sometimes you have some those fluctuations. So in the end, you end up having a little difference between the US and Mexico, and it's probably a little higher. We try to get as much close as possible to the US dollar because of our closeness to the market, but we end up being a little higher in terms of pricing.
Does that mean that it's not, in a way, a mass market product, that fewer people can afford it because the standard of living is lower, or the cost
we try to cater let's say lower middle class upwards, but we try to get as much as possible product that can actually cater to everyone. But of course, pricing is a challenge, and that happens, let's say, when you have a local production brand and an international brands. There's a natural selection in terms of pricing. There are certain prices that if you have a local brand with local production, you'll be able to have a very low price, which we cannot definitely get into there. It's impossible with our cost efficiencies and with our cost constructions coming from Asia. It's very complicated getting to, let's say, a very mass-driven market, right?
Mm-hmm. What about financing for expansion? Do you get bank loans or do you depend on headquarters?
No, we usually, it's not as complicated as you might think. There's a lot of support from financial institutions in Mexico. We have credit lines in Mexico that can actually help develop product and actually help bring product. So it's not as complicated. There's a lot of financial institutions, both at a national level and a private level that you can actually use. So it's more of a local financing scheme, and through banks and through financial institutions, what you can actually do.
Very interesting. What would you say are the brand promises between different kinds of footwear, Adidas and ASICS that you've worked for versus Reebok now?
This is a question that I get a lot. So philosophically, each one has a different history, and this is one of the things that I love. So Addias thinks that they make life better through sport, keyword being sport, right? And that means that they will try to get people to enjoy the idea of sports, the Olympics, team sports, so on and so forth. ASICS, which actually means anima sana in corpore sano, comes from the idea that Mr. Onitsuka wanted to have health and health benefits and wellness through physical activity. That's what anima sana in corpore sano means, is you have a healthy body and you have a healthy mind, right? So that means that you can do whatever, and you can do yoga, you can do martial arts, you can do it's not a sport as it is. It's basically wellness through physical activity. And the most recent brand statement or brand claim that Reebok has is life is not an spectator sport. And that means that basically you have to go out there. You have to be more active. You have to be more, let's say, present. You have to be physically active, regardless of who you are. So the first one has to do a bit more about doing sports as an activity. The other one is about wellness. And the third one, which is Reebok's right now, it's more about helping people to get out there and be more present in their lives. It's more inclusive. It's not only about doing sports or physical activity, it's about participating into life and being more activity into it. So it's the same industry with three different philosophies. And that I think that's very interesting how these three companies get into the market and drive their products differently.
And these are the same brand promises that are in the US and in other countries, right?
Basically, those are the global three promises for the three brands. Yes,
and that's the way it should be.
That's the way it should be.
Not always happens, but that's the way it should be. Yes.
Well, at least I can tell you with sporting goods brands, I think the brands have a similar or very close to similar to global promise, especially because again, assets, brand campaigns, brand experiences. The only thing that happens is that they get translated differently to the market, but we try to work with the global promise of the brand at a local level as close as possible. I think that's the right thing to do. Maybe just doing a little customization, trying to figure out what works on the market, what doesn't work in the market, but trying to get that idea right. In Reebok, we're trying to help people get into their life, be more active. And I think that let's say in each specific market, it can be a little bit different. But the idea is just to try to get that global idea executed as closer into the market as possible.
Can you give us some idea of how you would tweak the product or tweak the marketing message for the Mexican market versus, for example, the US market?
Sure. Let's say I'm going to use an old activity for Reebok. They used to sponsor CrossFit, right? So, of course, there was this huge CrossFit chains in the US. There were a lot of activities doing that. They had CrossFit games and so on and so forth. But what you can actually do instead of just doing CrossFit, what you can do is this kind of cross-training activity and do an experience that might not be related directly to that brand or that PI, but you land that into an experience that has exactly the same physical experience. So maybe there's not a CrossFit chain of WODs in Mexico, but you try to get that experience and try to make it more attainable to the Mexican consumer. So that is one. The other one is, for example, at some point they were sponsoring Le Mills, which was a fitness philosophy kind of brand, but in Mexico it didn't exist. So they found at that time what was equivalent for this. So it was fitness studios that maybe was not Le Mil, but it was a chain of fitness and wellness experiences that you could do in Mexico. So you try to find whatever gets closer to the global experience if you're not able to bring that brand or that specific collab into the marketplace.
Yeah, very interesting. And what about retail distribution? Many shops in Mexico tend to be small, what we would call mom and pop shops. versus more large department stores that you would find in the United States?
Well, that's a little misconception. We do have large, for example, department stores in Mexico. There's Liverpool, there's Palacio de Hierro, there's Suburbia, there's Sears, there's a few others. So there's actually similarity, right? There's a lot of multi-branded sporting goods companies in Mexico. There's Sinova, there's Mr. Tennis, there's Sportico, there's a few others that have a similar feeling to what you can see in the US. I think the difference lies that sometimes trying to get into the rest of the market, secondary cities and so on and so forth, there might not be a large department store. So you have to go to those multi-branded retail chains and have a conversation with them and try to get a better experience. So, but it's not as dissimilar as you might think, right? Some of the exceptions might be right now in mass market chains. For example, in Mexico, we have this very unique distribution channel called catalogs. So they basically sell catalogs like old catalogs before that. So they have a lot of sales force they get everywhere, and that's probably the closer you get to an old catalog in the US, what you get in the back of the magazines. And that's a huge market in Mexico. But that's something that is unique. Otherwise than that, it's very close to the US. You have a department stores, multi-branded sporting goods. You have a lot of lifestyle brands. And some of the, let's say, retail brands in the US are coming to Mexico at some point or another. So it's not as similar as you might think.
Okay. Oh, very interesting. Thank you. What are some of the benefits and appeals that you use in Mexico? Are they different than in the US? And are the Mexican benefits and appeals similar or the same that one would also use in Latin America?
Well, if you're a global expat coming to Mexico, there's a lot of benefits. First is the quality of life, right? You can have for example, if you're living in Miami, you can have a small apartment that you're paying $4,000 or $5,000 to live in Miami Beach. If you come here, you'll probably get a much larger house. You can have a quality of life that it's better. Not in every place in South America and Central America you get the same, but it can be similar, right? Argentina has great living standards. Guatemala is surprisingly good. But some of the benefits that you can have in Mexico is, for example, the social benefits in law. You cannot, if you get fired, if you get your relationship shortened with your employer, then Mexico is one of those employers that has a lot of protection towards the employee. Right. And if you're you can have that. And not in all places in Latin America you have that. But of course, there's Guatemala, Panama. Those will have different benefits. For example, in Panama, you don't pay taxes as it is. It's basically you get a tax-free. But let's say you don't have social benefits, the law, the tax law.
Were you saying taxes on footwear or taxes, personal income taxes?
Personal income.
Okay.
Right, and of course, if you want to commercialize a product in Panama, it's almost the taxes are almost non-existent. So you can actually sell products at a cheaper price, which in Mexico is different. You have a lot of let's say if you have a lot of duties, it's very protective in terms of that.
In terms of the marketing messages, are the marketing messages pretty much the same throughout Latin America, or do you change them for different countries?
They should be the same. The only challenge that you have in South America, especially for these kind of brands, is that they're on a different seasonality, right? When we're in summer, they're in winter. So what they do, and what some of the markets do, is they buy the product for spring, summer, and they save it for fall, winter. So they're a season late. Right, and some of the weather in South America is more extreme. Mexico is a bit milder, so if you don't have winter clothes, right? If you want to sell, for example, snowboard outfits or boots, we don't have that. And maybe in Chile and Argentina they do have stronger winters, and that's probably one of the bigger difference. We're on a different season, and they have more extreme seasons as it is.
No, that would make sense. Yes.
Yeah.
Um, you've also worked in your career with other brands such as Pepsi and Nokia. Uh, what did you do differently from how they would market in their home countries versus how they would market their products in Mexico?
Well, Pepsi for start is a global brand. So basically, we have the same products, almost the same seasonality. Sometimes the only challenge that you have there is distribution, right? So I can tell you that Pepsi in the U.S. and Pepsi in Mexico, they're marketed fairly similar. When I was at Nokia, the main challenge was trying to get uh, the higher priced or the higher end products into the Mexican market. They used to sell, you remember the 1100s? We sold millions of those in Mexico. We're trying to get there, trying to bring, let's say, the more tech sophisticated products into Mexico. That was a bit more challenging. And when I was in Nokia, the bigger challenge was that there was basically no one had data plans. Now it sounds silly, but no one had data. So if you had a very sophisticated business phone, you had to sell it with a data plan to actually use it. So we had at that time in place, we were fighting against BlackBerry. iPhone was not even relevant. So we're trying to explain people why data plans were important, the kind of the usage that you could actually have in that. Of course, now everybody has a data plan. Everybody has a smartphone.
Right.
So way back then, we were just selling little phones, and the cool thing was trying to sell text messages through your numerical keyboard. It was very interesting. And let's say in Europe, they were more developed. They were using high-end cameras, high-end multimedia devices, and we were just basically doing that. So at that point, I think the development of the market was very different between what was happening in Europe and sometimes in the US and what was happening in Mexico. It was a different moment in terms of the usage of technology as it was.
Very interesting also.
Yeah.
Back to Reeboks and sportswear or footwear. Um, are there any unique challenges that you face in Mexico that your counterparts in other parts of the world do not face? For example, in Asia or Africa, wherever.
Well, I can tell you that one of the bigger challenges in Mexico is let's say the stability sometimes with the government relations. I'll tell you a little story. About some 12 years ago, the the Mexican executive, the president, said that they're going to lower the duties for sporting goods. They were trying to protect the footwear market in Mexico, but they understood that basically athletic footwear was not there. So they're going to lower it from 30% to 10%. Everybody was happy about that because we were going to be able to compete better in better pricing. And let's say in that sense, we can actually have better pricing against the US.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened, of course, is as you can have in a country such as ours, is once the commitment had happened, and then there was a change of president, he basically forgot about it. So we've been waiting for that for the last 10 years, and it hasn't happened. The other one is, of course, and I can get sometimes in Africa, we can have a challenge like that, but exchange rate is always challenging because you have to be very careful on how you price your products, how you plan your pricing. So if there's any devaluation, if there's any fluctuation between the US dollar and the Mexican peso, you can actually react better. So those are probably those quirks that you can have that. And the other one, of course, sometimes you have to deal with product theft. Sometimes you have to deal with insecurity or safety issues in some of the regions. But if you're smart enough, you can actually prepare for that and try to avoid it as much as possible. But I think those are the main challenges that you can actually get in Mexico, different for Asia or maybe in Europe or in other regions.
And that raises another question of return on investment. Is the ROI in Mexico similar to the United States, or are there different expectations for the different
I think it can be, but you have to be better at planning and smarter in the way that you manage the business. For example, it's better to have direct to consumer in Mexico or you have a larger part of your business getting better margins. Wholesale or retail in Mexico can be challenging at some points. But if you have that mix and you cater directly to the consumer through your DTC channels, let's say e-com or retail, and you have a healthy retailer or wholesale partners, you can actually have a similar return to investment. And sometimes you can actually have better. If you have an aspirational product, maybe pricing can be higher. Let's say you're launching a GC shoe in Mexico. Well, if you're smarter, you can actually manage pricing better so you can have better margins. So there's pros and cons. You can manage it both ways.
Very interesting also. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
No, I think overall the challenges of managing global brands in markets such as Mexico or Latin America, you just have to be very aware of what are the quirks and the nuances of the country. It can be very interesting. You have to have local knowledge and local people that actually work with you so they can help you navigate through that. And you have to understand that a global strategy sometimes will need to be, let's say, tweaked a bit to make sure that it works. I think the bigger challenge that I've seen is when they have global brands that want to implement exactly the same strategy in the marketplace, and that's probably when they fail. They need to go global. I know it's a little old term, but if you have that global strategy with local execution, it will definitely work much better.
That makes perfect sense because obviously the world is not the same. And
it's not the same. A lot of brands think, or a lot of people at global headquarters think that it is, but it's not. And I think, in my experience, if you want to do something based on a brand that is based on Finland or in Boston or in Kobe, and you don't understand that there's slight differences, you will fail, or at least you'll have a bit of a headache on your execution.
Yes, and you mentioned a very good example of the different seasons in Latin America.
And that's one. The other one is you have for example, you think that the life cycle of technology is the same, and it's not the same. Right. Or if you actually think that the pricing or let's say the out of pocket that consumer has is the same across, and it's not. So those are conversations you need to have, and you need to understand even those there's a lot of similarities, and you might think that the market is homogeneous everywhere. It's not. It's there's certain quirks, and I think that's probably the bigger challenge for the global headquarters and the global strategy, just to make sure that you have to probably customize it a bit to make sure that it's the right strategy and the right execution.
And to always listen to the local executives in country as you are.
Absolutely.
Very good.
And that is always a challenge, trying to make sure that you're listened to and that they understand that there's those differences, right? And of course, when you're on a global level, you have to hear the people at a local level or a regional level, right? There might be a regional execution that you want to do, but I can tell you that I had a lot of challenges making sure that the teams in South America did what the global operator at the time, American Mobile, wanted to do across the region, right? There was different seasonalities, there were different calendars, and of course, there's also different politics. And that's probably one of the bigger challenges as well when you're trying to execute a global, from a global perspective or regional perspective, going to the market. Just try to make sure that there's certain standards, but you let them execute the right way.
Very fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Teo. This has been
thank you very much.
It's been a wonderful talk with Teo Husemann, and I hope all of you will join us next week for another edition of Global Gurus and their stories of international business. Thank you.